Hey there folks, and welcome to Chapter 14, The Origin of Species. Hang on, because this is our only video for this chapter. It's the shortest chapter so far, so hang in there. When we are looking at evolution, and especially concerning Darwin's work, when we're looking at the origin of species, it is vital to consider what is speciation, how are we defining species when we consider them, and how does speciation happen. So for the purposes of biology, speciation is the process of one species branching off into more than one new species. And there's different ways of actually defining a species. Typically speaking, when we are talking about a scientific species, we are using the biological definition of a species, which means that you have a group of organisms that can reproduce with each other, but cannot reproduce with a number of other organisms. They are reproductively isolated. They can't reproduce with other people or other species. Every once in a while, there are species that are closely related enough to each other that if they find each other, say in the wild, they can reproduce with one another, and their offspring are called hybrids. You can also get hybrids that do not occur naturally and may be the result of artificial selection, say in the case of the savanna cat. This little cat, actually it's not a little cat, is the offspring of the wild African serval and the domestic house cat. These two will never ever find each other in nature. It's human mediated to create a new pet breed. Savannas are awesome, big, smart, need a lot of space. The morphological species concept is based on exterior features, how the animals and plants are shaped, and how that can lead us to figure out relationships between different species and figure out which is a distinct different species and which are more closely related. The ecological species concept focuses on a species' ecological needs. What do they need to maintain a population? And what are their ecological niches? What niches, perhaps? What are their behaviors and physical adaptations that make them very well adapted to live where they do live? The phylogenetic species concept has to do with species in evolutionary context and figuring out which specific species are closely related enough to each other to have a single common ancestor, gradually moving up into a larger group of animals or plants or anything that have a large variety between them, but still have one single common ancestor, so we can figure out where that group of organisms split off from the overall evolutionary family tree. For instance, we might look at the African serval and the savanna cat, but also group into it other similar felines until we could figure out that, okay, this group, if you go back far enough, all descend from one species. That's one branch of the evolutionary family tree. When we discuss reproductive isolation, there's a number of ways that this isolation is maintained. See, part of the consequence of that reproductive isolation is it's part of what keeps species apart from each other so they don't just merge again. There are a number of different ways in which species can be reproductively isolated from each other. These are all different types of reproductive barriers. There are two major categories: pre-zygotic, meaning that this occurs before the individuals could even mate, and post-zygotic, which means this happens after mating. Pre-zygotic barriers include things like living in different types of habitat, or reproducing at different times of year, or courting with very different behaviors. So very different behaviors are attractive to different species. They may not be shaped enough the same for mating to be possible, as in the case of these three different types of flowers. They all need pollinators, but the shape of each flower is designed to best suit a particular type of pollinator, and that pollinator isn't going to go to a type of flower that it isn't suited to. So that helps prevent, say, the saguaro cactus from coming in contact with the zinnia. Very, very different shapes. There's also the gametic barrier, which means that even if somehow the pollen of this flower did end up on that flower, the egg and sperm are not compatible. And just way right down there at the cellular basis, at that moment of fertilization, nope, not going to happen. They don't work together. Some examples of post-zygotic barriers that happen after breeding occurs are reduced hybrid viability. So remember that hybrid is what we call the offspring of two separate species. This here is a mule. It is a hybrid. It is the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Reduced hybrid viability means that the offspring may not survive. It may not, or at least not survive very long. Reduced hybrid fertility, which is the case with this mule, means that the offspring may be perfectly viable. They may mature just fine, lead a fairly normal length lifespan, be perfectly healthy, but they're sterile. They cannot reproduce. Hybrid breakdown also refers to the length and quality of life of that hybrid. They may not live as long. There may be severe physical or developmental issues that mean that a hybrid won't be viable, even if it makes it all the way to being born or hatched. It may just not live long enough to successfully be able to reproduce. Now, speciation is not a quick process, and there are a number of different ways that speciation can occur, all of which take some time. When a species ends up being separated, two groups of a species end up being separated by a physical, geographic barrier, this kind of speciation is called allopatric speciation. Something has come between them, and as time goes on, these two groups end up becoming adapted for their localized area. They end up going their separate ways. You can see this in a number of different examples, but this one here has to do with the porkfish that we find on either side of the Isthmus of Panama, on either side of the Panama Canal. They're still fairly closely related, even after all this time, but conditions are different enough on either side of the canal between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean that they have developed different adaptations, and they have developed different markings. They are visually different at this point, and that also helps play into courtship and sexual selection for reproduction. It is reinforcing the reproductive isolation. At this point, even if they did encounter each other again, they probably would not be able to reproduce because there's enough physical and behavioral differences. They don't use the same system anymore. On the other hand, another way in which we can get new species that does not involve a physical barrier is called sympatric speciation. This is where you get more than one species branching off in the same geographical region. Don't get me wrong, though, there's still something separating them. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't end up with new species. But what is separating them is not a physical barrier. Things that can lead to sympatric speciation include habitat differentiation. So if this area of the geographic region has this kind of habitat and this area of the same region over here has a slightly different habitat, or if the habitat changes over time, different populations of the same species may become better adapted to their own area, and that can start a species diverging into two different species. Sexual selection is another really big driver for differentiation. But here's another one. Polyploidy. Now, we discussed this earlier, long ago, when we were looking at DNA. But polyploidy is what we call the situation when an individual, or even a whole species, is just carrying more DNA than other related individuals, or other related species. Remember, ploidy refers to the number of copies of the same gene that an individual is carrying in their DNA. You're actually quite familiar with some really common examples of this. It's pretty unusual in animals. Our DNA does not handle that well, but plants handle it quite admirably. Bread wheat, the wheat that we make all of our flour and our bread out of, is polyploid. It has like 6 different copies of similar chromosomes. It's pretty darn different than a lot of its wild ancestors. But also most strawberries that you meet are octoploid. All right, count that out. Octoploid, 8 copies of the single gene for every single gene in its DNA. We like polyploid plants in our agriculture because they tend to be larger, fuller. Bread wheat is much larger than wild wheat. Octoploid strawberries, way bigger than little wild strawberries. All right, case in point. And even flowers that we use to decorate our homes that are grown for florists tend to be larger, like these daylilies on the right that have 4 copies of DNA versus diploid daylilies on the left with only 2 diploid. The origin of most plant species actually can be traced to polyploid speciation. They just handle it much more successfully than animals do. Another phenomenon that we note in evolution that animals are pretty good at, and plants as well, is called adaptive radiation. This is the case of what Darwin actually saw on the Galapagos. These are Darwin's finches, all of them. Adaptive radiation is what we call it when one species suddenly gives rise to a large number of species. And I say suddenly, but we're talking evolution here, so this takes a lot of time. And each species is best adapted to its own specific set of evolutionary and ecological circumstances. What Darwin noticed on the Galapagos Islands amongst all of these finches was the birds were different sizes, slightly different colors, but their beaks especially had a wide variety of different shapes. And Darwin figured out by watching these birds forage, by watching them eat, that the beak shape has to do with what food they specialize in eating. See, all of these finches over here, especially over here with the pointier beaks, these finches eat mostly insects. But these over here with thicker beaks, especially this guy, large ground finch, eat mostly seeds. See, the narrower beak is better for picking little insects out of bark or off the ground, but large beaks are better for cracking open seeds with really thick seed coats. Or say getting into tough cactus parts, all right, or cutting into buds and types of fruit, all right. Each shape has its own specialized diet that it's best suited for. This is adaptive radiation. Each one of these species was on its own on an island or 2 of the Galapagos archipelago for so long that they physically adapted to specialize in whatever dietary options, whatever food was highest quality and available locally. Another great modern day example of this is Lake Victoria in Africa. Lake Victoria has a really rich cichlid species. Now, a cichlid is a type of fish. These are all these fish over to the right. There's a lot of large, very, very deep lakes in southwestern Africa, where you can see where these arrows are coming from, that have large numbers of species of cichlids. But Lake Victoria boasts over 500. Just imagine that for a second. Over 500 species of this kind of fish. And they're all different species at this point. They've all been isolated in this lake long enough that they all go back to a single common ancestor. But they are all, as a result of adaptive radiation, they were all specialized to specific niches with particular behaviors in areas of the lake where they live and things they feed off of, when and how they reproduce, how they court each other, how they undergo sexual selection, all of these things that are reinforcing speciation, the divide between species, even though they still live in the same lake. So we have all of these things that reinforce speciation. Keep dividing, keep them apart. This is not to say, however, that this is always how it happens. Yes, frequently, speciation gets reinforced and they just keep spreading apart. Not always, though. Sometimes, when two species can meet and hybridize, the hybridization may continue. Areas where this occurs, say in this area of Ecuador, where these two related species of redstarts, a type of bird, can find each other and mate, these areas are called hybrid zones. You may note, in this redstart hybrid, it's got the yellow forehead of the golden-fronted redstart, but the orange crown of the spectacled redstart, and it doesn't have the spectacles of the spectacled redstart. It has that face from the golden-fronted redstart. So it's showing its hybridized parentage right there in its feathers and on its face. When hybridization is possible, it may be stable. If the hybrids are fit, they can reproduce, or at least they don't cause some kind of disadvantage to the population. We may have a stable system here. Okay, fine. They may not be super common, but they'll continue to occur. If they are viable and they can reproduce, eventually these species may fuse. These two species might reproduce together so often that so many new birds are hybrids that the two species may just fuse back into one species. And normally, if they cannot hybridize, or if the hybrids are inviable, or if they cannot breed, we have reinforcement of speciation, and the two different species will continue to go their separate ways. Alright folks, that's it for Chapter 14. This is a short one. I'll see you next time. Bye.